Hello and welcome to this video on opium. We just hope this video does not start a war like opium has. Opium has historically been grown in India, sold to China for tea leaves, and led to 100 years of China's occupation by foreign powers for trying to declare war on them. Kind of like post-World War II Berlin that was split between the Allied powers. The difference is that unlike World War II, which was started for economic and political reasons, the Opium War was started because China was sold an addictive drug in exchange for tea leaves, as Britain could not afford to buy tea leaves with silver or gold without going bankrupt. Opium is a drug produced by refining the unripe opium poppy seed pod. In terms of today, most opium poppies seem to be grown in places like Afghanistan and Pakistan, or rather ironically places where it is illegal to consume opium. While grown in places that could be described as deadly depending on sex, sexuality, religion and nationality, opium itself is not entirely deadly on its own. Opium does have legitimate medicinal uses. That is medicinal in a different term to what your grandma calls her glass of brandy, sherry or other strong alcoholic drink. We mean actual medicine. Opium contains a wide variety of alkaloids, at least 25, with the most significant being morphine. As you can imagine, morphine is a well-known and rather strong pain relief. 10 to 12% of raw opium is morphine. And then there's also things like codeine, thebane, papaverine, and noscapine. These are generally divided into two main groups. You have your phenethrines, which are things like morphine, codeine, and thebane, and they are partly there for pain relief, and they're also responsible, to a certain extent, for being a psychoactive. Then you have your isoquinolines, papaverine, noscapine. These are going to have minimal effect on your central nervous system, but they can help in other ways, such as relaxing smooth muscle. This is one reason why, to some extent, let's put this delicately, the use of certain pain relief can lead to issues around being constipated. The mechanism of action, other than causing constipation, is mostly driven by opioid receptors in the brain, spinal cord, and peripheral tissues. These are largely divided into the Greek letter opioid receptor. This can be mu, kappa, delta, and there's a few others, but the three main ones are going to be your mu receptors, your kappa receptors, and delta receptors. Mu receptors are responsible for pain relief, a certain amount of euphoria, and alterations to breathing rates, and less extent, although rather significant depending on your circumstances, addiction. The morphine itself is what's going to affect this. Your kappa and delta receptors contribute somewhat to analgesia and sedation, but to a much lesser extent. When you have your alkaloid, for example morphine, bind to the appropriate receptor, it has a similar effect to an endorphin. It basically mimics it, and this inhibits the release of other neurotransmitters, such as substance P, and this then leads to a cascade of effects, causing a reduction in pain perception. The pain hasn't gone away, you just don't feel it anymore. In other ways, it affects another mechanism called the inhibition of adenosine cyclases. This reduces cyclic AMP levels, and therefore you get a reduction in neuronal signaling. And then last we have modulation of ion channels. All neurons have on their surface, and particularly along the axon, a series of ion channels that are needed for polarization. Without polarization, you don't get a transmission of the action potential. No action potential, no communication, or whatever the neuron's trying to pass on the message of. Mostly we're talking here about calcium, but the others can be altered as well. In terms of pharmacodynamics, well, we have the obvious fact that it's a pain relief or analgesic, but it does so through a central nervous system depressant effect. That is, it slows down the activity of your neurons. The most well-known are obviously analgesia, but also to a certain extent sedation and euphoria. This is one reason why milk of the poppy was a well-known relaxant and feel good before it was regulated and they took it out of all the good drinks. So no cocaine in Coke anymore, no readily accessible morphine, there's just no fun things anymore. And damn those pesky regulations. But in terms of people who use it, there are some actual significant issues to consider, other than addiction. You do have problems around respiratory depression, that is, it slows down your breathing rate. That's done by altering parts of the brain's respiratory control center, meaning that you can theoretically, for all intents and purposes, suffocate yourself by using opium-based pain relief. There are gastrointestinal effects as mentioned, mostly around motility, and that is your bowels don't move as well, and therefore you don't get things coming out the other end anywhere near as quickly or as easily. In the old day, it was used somewhat more liberally to suppress cough, and as a result could have helped. The pharmacokinetics are a little more, let's say, questionable, partly because there are multiple ways of ingesting opium. You have rather obviously historically smoking it, but you can largely ingest or inject it now. Ingestion is through, say, tablets containing morphine products, or injecting it, such as heroin. Arguably, the fastest delivery mechanism is smoking, because it more or less goes from the nasal cavity into blood vessels there and then through to the brain, without drastically altering the half-life. But then you have the, consumption orally, which it's a lot slower. Now, injecting it depends on where it's injected as to where it fits in this hierarchy. Arguably, the closer to the brain it is, the faster the effect comes on. The further away from the brain, the slower. In terms of its distribution in your body, alkaloids are relatively easily able to permeate throughout most of your body, and this includes the blood-brain barrier, which is how it can access the central nervous system, or basically your brain and spinal cord, and cause the various effects. The half-life is up to, let's say, 48 to 96 hours after use, or 2 to 4 days. Most of this comes out of your body in the form of urine waste material. In order to get there, though, it first gets metabolized in the liver, and the metabolism takes the morphine and breaks it down into another morphine product, which is inactive. From that, it's then excreted out of the body. Codeine is a little bit different in that it needs to be converted from codeine to morphine via an enzyme to work as effectively, but then does get broken down the same way. Administration, as mentioned, is going to vary somewhat depending on exactly who's using it and how, and largely in what context. If you're a early 20th century or late 19th century Chinaman, you're probably smoking it, and then having addiction issues when the British come in and steal all your tea leaves. The effect is rapid, within minutes typically speaking, and generally used to get that fast rush. Oral is slower, as mentioned, but generally used for a controlled long-term release. For example, pain relief for, say, a joint pain, long-term injuries, and so on. Injection is the arguably worst option in many respects outside of a clinical setting, because it has a high risk of overdose and generally gives the highest concentration. You're basically putting a massive amount of pure morphine, or equivalent opium product, into your body. This is why smoking, because you're burning a relatively small amount and it obviously has to be vaporized, you're not inhaling all of it. The potentiality for opium to be lethal is all down to its pharmacological effects, the risk of overdose and long-term health issues, and in the case of injecting it, contamination. We've already mentioned issues, say, for example, with respiration, but there are plenty of other problems that can happen. So we have, obviously, overdose, which that would be the first thing that comes to people's mind, and that's, again, down to that respiration issue. That is respiratory depression. Your body decides, okay, I don't need to breathe anymore because I'm quite high and happy. Which, yes, it's a very short-term happiness, but it doesn't last very long because you'll be dead. The mechanism of death is relatively redundant, but it's basically suffocation or hypoxia. Hypoxia then leads to brain damage leads to coma, a coma eventually becomes death. Then we have what can exacerbate this. Mostly we're talking about the dose here. As a natural product, like with most natural products, there's not just a lot of variability, but inconsistency in exactly what's in the content of the opium, poppy. Typically speaking, you're going to get a difference in exactly what concentration, say, morphine, or what's codeine, and what everything else is, or whether or not it's actually the expected concentrations at all. And this is very often why natural products are not really used. They're generally either processed to get a standardized dose, or at least to know what the actual content is. Then we have tolerance. Tolerance is not just handling people you don't want to handle, but in this case it's that your body gets used to not only the effect of the drug, but the euphoria associated with it, and so you have to chase the magical dragon, and eventually you overdose. There are other ways you can have trouble though, and it's not just in terms of the tolerance of the drug, it's, well, if you have other medication you're on, one of the big considerations is alcohol. The reason for this is that alcohol is another central nervous system depressant and slows down transmission of messages, and as a result, it can amplify the effect, leading you to more quickly and certainly more definitively suffocate yourself to death. In other instances, the lack of sensation and understanding of your body because your brain is so high, it can lead to things like choking on your own vomit and then dying. We've mentioned the issue around injecting particularly already, but injecting is a concern not just because it's a high dose, but because you're injecting a high dose and circumventing the major immunological defense of your body, the skin, allowing for not only to be injected with a large amount of a drug in a relatively uncontrolled manner, but possibly allowing for pathogens to enter your body by circumventing the skin or entering through that hole you made. The issues around using high doses are fairly well studied in some contexts. Some countries have found that the dose taken by people who are addicted to opium-based products toes very close, if not exactly on the line, of what would be considered a fatal overdose. Now, this is not true of everybody and everything, but it's true that on the low end, you would need, somewhere around the range of 3,000 milligrams of morphine, and unfortunately, some people consume that or more a day. Treatment for it is, well, not just an acute problem, but thankfully something we do have answers to now. Naloxone is basically the go-to treatment. The first and obvious result is that, well, it stops a lot of the issues associated with it, primarily by restoring breathing. Naloxone also reverses the opioid effects, which is kind of important. Now, depending on how long the person has been overdosed for, you may need to give them supplemental oxygen, or, in some extreme cases, mechanical ventilation. Longer term, things are a little more clear-cut, as most people are at least somewhat familiar with what addiction leads to. Well, addiction is pretty much the major thing there, but it can have other effects that aren't necessarily obvious, especially if you aren't looking into the details of this. First, you have cardiovascular effects. Some research would suggest that opium increases the risk of developing, say, atherosclerotic plaques in your arteries, causing myocardial infarct and certain arrhythmias. It's not necessarily the most definitive of research, but it's there. There is a certain cancer risk, although this comes from IARC, so we're skeptical to say that it's necessarily the case, but IARC has put it down as a group 1 carcinogen. The, let's say, most likely reason for this is simply that it's esophageal cancer, lung cancer, bladder cancer, and CNS cancer. We would imagine the esophageal and lung cancer is pretty much all down to the fact that you are smoking something hot. The bladder cancer is a little more unexpected, and central nervous system likely is a result of a lot of these alkaloid or morphine type products containing lead, and lead is a well-known carcinogen, and this does lead to the obvious effect of lead poisoning, which we're talking here about the metal lead and not the kind that comes out of the end of a gun, although that can also cause poisoning and death. Issues around infection, and particularly viral infections, such as HIV, but you can have plenty of other viruses and bacteria that cause the same problems. And then again, we do have withdrawal. Withdrawing from some drugs is lethal, and not just because people aren't happy, but the actual process can kill people due to things like tachycardia, issues around blood pressure rising drastically, issues around the body just not coping, and why in some instances things like methadone are used, and in other cases again it's literally better to put someone in a coma and then withdraw them from the drug so they don't suffer as much, or at least the family caring for them doesn't suffer as much. In comparison to something like heroin, opium's lethality is a little more, let's say, potent, although not quite. It would be better to say that raw opium is less potent, but then again you have things like morphine and heroin. Heroin is much more potent than opium is, and also more than morphine, which means if you're going to put these in a hierarchy, strictly speaking, the more raw or unrefined the product, technically the safer it is, although safer in terms of it may not kill you immediately, it'll just take a little longer. So not safe, but safer. That risk does, however, add up over time, whereas, say, the risk with heroin is fairly acute. You're more likely to either die or get high with heroin because the safe dose is very close to the fatal dose, whereas the opium use has a much wider margin for error. But wider margin for error does mean that you can use it more frequently and for longer without dying. The pharmacology of opium shows that there's a fairly solid reason why it can relieve pain, and to a certain extent why it induces euphoria, but that does come with certain costs, and certainly definite risks. Things like respiratory depression, which could lead to your death, especially if you're, say, on other medication, you're drinking alcohol, or you already have comorbidities. There are questionable studies into the risk associated with things like cancer, cardiovascular disease, and so on, and there's certainly going to be a degree of organ damage. And finally, you have inconsistency in the product itself. Simply because it's a natural product with no real processing or quantification, it leads to unpredictable results. Now, sometimes these unpredictable results aren't so bad, they're relatively minor fluctuations. Other times, they are serious and they can cause, life-threatening problems. And this does amplify its danger. Yes, we do have acute treatments like naloxone that can help with the overdose, but having a solution to it is not the problem. The problem is the actual problem. The fact that we need a solution just shows how widespread and how much damage it's doing. It still retains a certain amount of, let's say, historical and cultural utility, and that's nice, but at the same time it's also a major threat to health and well-being. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing, and please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.